never forget that day. Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. I sat on the edge of my bed, leaning forward, devastated. I just knew I was watching leaked footage from an unreleased movie. As the planes got closer to the building, my years of TV watching prepared me for the commercial break that always comes when there's a peak in the action. You know what I'm talking about. When you're watching the TV, you're on the edge of your seat, your heart is racing, you're holding your breath, and then you hear, "This commercial break was brought to you by TEDxTaraBlvd, your partners in diversity, equity, and inclusion." Except this time, there was no commercial break. No pause in the action for the hero to have a stroke of genius that made everything okay. Just a realization that we had to hold our breath and brace for impact. As the planes went to and through those towers, our sensibilities crumbled to the ground as those towers crumbled into the rubble. And in our devastation, we tried to find the words, and all we could muster was, "I can't believe this happened." And when we said it, we knew it was only partially true, because the whole truth is, we couldn't believe it happened to us. But why? Why couldn't we believe it happened? Not because we hadn't seen this around the world. We've seen marketplaces bombed. We've seen children maimed and families terrorized and destroyed by terroristic attacks. But it was happening over there and to them. The scene wasn't new. The location was. And because it wasn't happening to us, we cocooned ourselves in this fantastical reality that it couldn't happen. The other day that I will never forget is Wednesday, January 6th, 2021, the day an angry mob stormed the U.S. Capitol. And again, we were stunned. I saw people with tears in their eyes, heartbroken and devastated, and as they tried to muster the words, all they could come up with was, "I can't believe this happened." And as they said those words, my mind flashed back to September 11th, 2001, when we heard the exact same words, and I had the exact same question. But why? Why couldn't you believe this happened? Because we'd seen this angry mob behavior before. U.S. history is plagued with it. It was an angry mob that met a Black 6-year-old Ruby Bridges at the entrance of an elementary school, screaming death threats and hate speech, and even encouraging their own children to join in on the hatred. A 6-year-old had to have armed guards just to start elementary school because of an angry mob. It was angry mob behavior that assaulted diners at lunch counters, pouring drinks on them and throwing food at them, and sometimes physically dragging them from their seats and out into the street because they did not want to enjoy their meals next to a person of a different race. It was angry mobs that enjoyed picnics where the centerpiece was a Black man's hanging body from a tree and burned, while they celebrated alongside their family. And while that may seem like it was so long ago, what about the angry mob that included a uniformed sheriff officer that showed up at 18-year-old Damian Shepard's home in May of 2020? U.S. history is plagued with demonstrations where angry mobs have terrorized people and sometimes even towns, so the behavior was not new. But the reality was, and the whole truth was, what people were actually saying was, "I can't believe it happened to us." Oh yes, I know about Ruby Bridges and Emmett Till and Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Jamesburg Jr. and Birmingham, Alabama, and the 4 little girls, but that wasn't us. Oh, but let me tell you, it was us. And for once, all of us got to see what some of us have seen, known, and experienced as citizens in the United States. Some of us always knew that this angry mob behavior could not be contained and it would show up at the U.S. Capitol. Some of us always knew that if we didn't make what happened to some of us a problem for all of us, we would never be a united us. DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion are the buzzwords that's being thrown around lately. But what are we really doing to be inclusive? I mean, what's happening? What are the new essentials for us to go from it happened to them to it happened to us? The reality is it's simple. All we have to do is care. CARE. Have daring conversations. Take tangible and inclusive action. Work towards reconciliation and be intentional about the education of others and their historical context and contribution. Let's say, I want you to imagine, just imagine for me for a moment, that you took a class on carpentry. And in that class, you learned all about the tools, their history, their names, their purpose, their impact. And you were excited about what you learned until you got to the build site and you looked around and realized no one had ever taught you how to actually use those tools. Well, as an international diversity, equity, inclusion consultant, this is exactly what I see when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion education. We learn the names, we learn the right things to say, we learn the tools, but we never develop the conversational competence to use those tools in a way that's productive. I find companies that have spent thousands upon thousands and tens of thousands of dollars and realize we haven't moved the needle on inclusion, because that conversational competence is the invisible and unspoken barrier that allows us to hold up a picture of inclusivity without actually having the reality of it. The new essential for inclusion is having bold and daring conversations where people may be uncomfortable and disagree, but they engage and come out to a productive end. Until we have deep, daring, and honest conversations, we will never attain inclusion. And the old adage is right. Actions and words must go together, because words without actions fall flat. And that could have not been more true than what has happened lately when we saw these major corporations putting out statements supporting Black Lives Matter and statements in support of Black and brown communities. Except when we went to look into their organizational structure, we saw no Black and brown people in senior leadership making decisions at the tops of the organizations. Their actions did not match their words, and so their words fell flat. If we're going to really talk about inclusion, we have to be very clear that the day and the time is up for these empty conversations that lead us to live in monuments of nothingness. People want conversations that lead to tangible and inclusive action. Action has to be a new essential in the inclusion conversation. Now, when you think about it, when a people or a person or a group has been wronged and violations have been committed, there is no inclusion without reconciliation. For the people that have been wronged will exclude in fear of repeated violation, and the people that have done wrong will exclude in fear of retribution. South Africa showed us how to do this well with their implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1955. The commission received international attention because it was one of the first times where public hearings were held and victims were able to tell the whole truth about their experience alongside perpetrators who told the full truth about the violations that they committed. Because there is freedom in the truth. And until we begin to embrace the fact that we have to reconcile past wrongs, make them right, and be honest about our way forward, we will never truly embrace inclusivity. Because a failure to reconcile eliminates the possibility of inclusion. It is easier to fool people than to convince them that they have been fooled. This is a quote often attributed to Mark Twain, but with just a little bit of research, you can find that the actual author is unknown. However, people quote the phrase and attribute credit to Mark Twain without even thinking twice about it, and will probably argue you down if you try to tell them that Mark Twain wasn't the original author. Ironically, or maybe not so ironically, the phrase and quote is a victim of what it's talking about, for it is truly easier to fool or miseducate people than to convince them that they have been fooled or miseducated. The same is true for what happens around inclusion. With just a little bit of research, you can find volumes of information about someone else, but a considerable number of people never take time to learn anything on their own about another group of people or even correct what has been taught to them about history. But here's the deal. Education has to be an inside job. I study this stuff. I dig down, I read books, and I dig into the history of other people to find out their historical context and their contribution. And I recognize I have to teach my own children, because the current gaps that exist in an education system where Black and brown people's stories should be are wide, and I have to fill the gaps for my children. If we're going to truly be inclusive, we have to be intentional about educating ourselves about other people's history and their impact on our world at large. Now, just a little bit of a surface research into world history will show you that the great empires fell because invaders with stronger armies were able to come in, penetrate, and defeat the quote-unquote world's strongest army. But if you do a deeper dive, you will actually find that the failure was an internal failure that allowed for external forces to prevail. Men became hungry for power. They put individual power over a united strength. And those that had power did everything to keep it and exclude others from it. And those that didn't have power clamored for it, and neither regarded the other. The exclusion continued, the internal empire broke down, and external invaders were able to take credit for a defeat that had already occurred internally. And much like September 11th and January 6th, we've seen this movie play out before. We've seen the great empires fall because they failed to embrace the new essentials of inclusion. And if we are going to be that beacon on the hill, the land of the free and the home of the brave, inclusion is not just an option, it's our lifeline. And it's simple. All we have to do is care. Be concerned and have deep and daring conversations that lead us to an outcome. Take tangible and inclusive action, work towards reconciliation, and be intentional about the education of others and their historical context and impact. Because until we make what happens to some of us a problem for all of us, we will never be a united us.